The next topic we'll talk about is counting with moles. Now, a lot of people hear the word moles and they think you're talking about a little rodent or a mouse that crawls underneath the ground. We're not talking about that. What we are talking about is a number, a representation. So as you look at this page here, there are a lot of words that represent numbers. For example, we can say a pair of shoes. So a pair of shoes simply means two, a word that means a number. A dozen, again, a word that means a number. And we've done this for several reasons. It's easier to keep track of things. Instead of saying 12 eggs, we say a dozen eggs. It's a good way to keep track and to sell things. The last thing is a ream, which is 500 sheets. That's what paper comes in. Now, when scientists were thinking about particles and atoms and ions and molecules, it's tough. They're really, really tiny. And so what they thought was, well, maybe we need a really big number because to understand and to study things, we really should have a large number. A big handful of particles or atoms is a lot easier to study than just one or two. It's sort of like if you got Legos for a gift when you were a child, you wouldn't want one or two Legos. That would be little pieces of Legos and not very fun. Instead, the more the merrier. Go get the Costco set, right? We want a whole bunch of them. It's easier, it's fun, it's a good time. So with science and chemistry, we want a huge number. And look at this number. It is a big number. That's a lot of zeros. We call this number Avogadro's number. And Avogadro's number is simply just like a dozen for chemistry. It's huge, and we typically write it in scientific notation. All right, and that's a number we'll talk about a lot. But the mole is a very important number concept idea to understand. So when you look at the periodic table, we see all kinds of things going on with this. Most of the time, you're going to see with tile, you're going to see a few things. This number right here is what we call the atomic mass. Now remember, the atomic mass is the average mass of one atom. The average mass of one mole of one atom. So one mole, and that's where we get this word from, the mole. It's a handful. That handful of carbon would have a mass of 12.011. Now, a lot of times we'll just simply call that 12, but sometimes you'll see it as 12.01 too. All right, from the periodic table, you can see that that number is pretty important. We're going to use a lot. Now, if this is just a visual representation, carbon's not the only one. Sulfur is another one. Sulfur has 32.1 grams. That's a mole. 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd atoms would have a mass of 32.1 grams. Now, we can have this mole is because we can do a lot of things with it. We can figure out a lot of things with it. And so, for example, we can look at carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide will help us figure out, since we have one carbon, and one carbon would be 12. We could add it up. We don't have to do this, or excuse me, this doesn't apply to just atoms. It applies to molecules too. Carbon dioxide is a molecule. And then I know that oxygen here, since there are two of them, I'm going to take two and I'm going to look at my periodic table and it's going to be 16. And so I can add all these up, and this is 12. 16 times 2 is going to be 32. And then when I add these up right here, I can get a grand total of 45. So we're going to use this in a lot of ways. 45 grams is how we would represent something called the molar mass, which means what is the mass of 1 mole of carbon dioxide? And again, this is like a dozen. You know, how much is a dozen of this? How much? It's a handful that we can study. All right. Now we also use the mole. As you can see, it's in the middle. We're going to spend a lot of time trying to understand this, but the idea is that we have sort of a standard. 1 mole of carbon or anything is going to equal this many grams, and that this many comes from the periodic table. We use that from the periodic table, whatever the number is. In this case, it's 12.01. And on the other side, we can look at how many atoms or particles. So the mole is like the central part of this whole concept. It's very important, and it's something we'll focus on a lot here the next week, excuse me.